So, who dropped the order? For those of you leaning now to the view that the order wrapped around cigars was intentionally dropped by someone passing Barton Mitchell as he and his comrades were stacking arms in the field. The question you must answer as jurors, judges of the facts in the trial court, is not who exactly it was that dropped the order, but whether you find it more likely than not that there were persons available to General Lee capable of walking past Barton Mitchell and dropping it without detection. Now, given the gaps in the evidentiary record that we cannot expect further investigation will fill, it is impossible to say with any degree of reasonable certainty who the person was who dropped it. But the evidence is sufficient for a jury to find as fact that there were residents of Frederick sufficiently connected to General Lee to be trusted with the mission of dropping it in a manner that would be likely found. Now, the prime suspects that fit the requirements are the Reverend Dr. John B. Ross and his wife, Mary McDowell. No doubt the cliques can offer others. A farmer, for example, owning fields in the outskirts of the town. But, as it is plain, given General Lee's denial to D.H. Hill after the war that he did not know how the order was lost, secrecy in the endeavor was a necessity. For Lee's doing this, he could expect would not be received well if it became known to the politicians at Richmond, much less the people generally, as the outcome sank into their consciousnesses. Here, all that can be offered as evidence in the trial as the record stands are these several facts. First, there is the story told by Kai Douglas that on the morning of September 6, 1862, a Saturday, Jackson was mounting a horse to ride forward toward Frederick. He was thrown to the ground. Injured in some way by the fall, Jackson, Douglas tells us, proceeded forward by riding in an ambulance to the Best Farm, where he established his headquarters camp. Doing this, Jackson delegated command of the advance into Frederick to D.H. Hill, who had joined him en route. D.H. Hill, with troops acting as provost marshal, entered the town. Where he established himself, the record does not say, nor is it clear where exactly his division went into camp. But the cliques offer the banks of Ballinger's Creek, just south of the Best Farm, as the division's campground. As Douglas tells it, on Sunday, September the 7th, Jackson, using the ambulance, entered the town in the evening hours and went to the German Reformed Church on Church Street near Courthouse Square. He took a seat in a pew in the jam-packed church and seemingly dozed while the pastor offered the congregation a sermon. Douglas does not provide a description of Jackson's whereabouts during the following 2 days, telling us only that on the early morning of Wednesday, September the 10th, Stonewall, now back in the saddle, rode through the town to Reverend Dr. John Ross's residence on 2nd Street and left a written message at the door, remounted, and went west out of the town toward South Mountain. The Reverend Dr. John B. Ross was the pastor of the Frederick First Presbyterian Church, holding this position since about 1856, when he came to Frederick from Lexington, Virginia, where he and Jackson had socialized during the period Jackson was a professor at VMI. Jackson's supposed stop at the Ross residence was first made public by the Baltimore Sun in April 1875, when it published a letter offered by a Frederick native named Samuel Tyler, who was then dean of the George Washington Law School in Washington, D.C. In his letter, Tyler described Jackson's stop at the Ross residence, much as Douglas later did, quoting, for the first time in public, the supposed text of Jackson's note left at Ross's door. Second is the fact that the record shows General Lee, Stuart, and Jackson, along with other officers, were present at the residence of a lawyer named William Ross, who owned a large house on Record Street just beyond Courthouse Square and a few doors away from the Reverend Ross's residence on 2nd Street. How much time during the period September the 7th to September the 9th these officers spent at or were in the vicinity of Lawyer Ross's house, the record does not say. Third is the fact that Charles Venable, a member of General Lee's headquarters staff, was Dr. Ross's wife's brother-in-law. The two men married the daughters of James McDowell, who had been governor of Virginia from 1843 to 1846. The record shows, too, that Venable had a close family relationship with Mary McDowell Ross that lasted to her death. In her declining years after her husband's death, Mary Ross lived with Venable and his family in Charlottesville, where he held the chair of the Department of Mathematics at the University of Virginia. And it was Venable who acted as the executor of Mary Ross's estate at her death. Unfortunately, a review of the will of Mary Ross does not provide any specificity, any identification that among her possessions at the time of her death was in fact an original note written in the hand of Stonewall. It's possible, given the general description of items the will relates, that the note may have been among these possessions which were transferred to her nieces. Last is the fact that the congregation of the First Presbyterian Church in September 1862 was split about equally between supporters of the Lincoln government and supporters of the Confederacy. Within days of the Union Army occupying Frederick, a schism developed among the congregation, the Lincoln supporters demanding that Dr. Ross's tenure as pastor be terminated. The congregation met in bank, the issue was argued, and Dr. Ross resigned his place, and within 2 weeks of the happening of the Battle of Antietam, with the pews of his church now filled with wounded Union soldiers, Dr. Ross and his wife Mary left Frederick and never returned. Now, over the years, I've attempted to make contact with the current pastors of the Frederick First Presbyterian Church, asking for access to the court diary, the court minutes, the church diary, the church minutes that are clearly preserved because of publications over the years the church has made about this meeting that the congregation held and the circumstances under which Dr. Ross left town. Those documents may shed light on this business about Jackson's actual appearance at Dr. Ross's residence at any time during the period in which the Confederate Army was in Frederick. Though it is impossible to say on the available record that with reasonable certainty it was probably the Rosses who were responsible for dropping the order at Barton Mitchell's feet, it is entirely reasonable to conclude that of whatever potential candidates one might select for the role, plainly the Rosses were the most likely of the cast to be selected by General Lee in conspiracy with Jackson to undertake the endeavor. For if not Jackson himself acting as Lee's agent in the setup, Charles Venable was the obvious person to make contact with the Rosses. Unlike Jackson, who would have the eyes of the townspeople following his every movement about the town, Venable would have been entirely unknown to the townspeople, just another Confederate officer among many. Venable might easily have moved in the darkness from Lawyer Ross's house down Record Street, entered the Ross residence without anyone noticing. Finally, it is reasonable to recognize the safest means of delivering the order to Mitchell is for a woman in a full dress of the time, strolling on the arm of her husband, apparently joining in the general welcoming of the soldiers by the town, and let slip from her hand the order to fall through the folds of her dress to the ground near where Mitchell and his squad were stacking their arms. So, though how it exactly happened, reasonable persons cannot say. We can say, however, that if we find as fact the order wrapped around cigars was intentionally dropped, General Lee certainly had residents available at Frederick willing to risk doing it.